The summer that broke everything came fast to the Texas Hill Country in 1883. The kind of heat that didn't just sit on your skin, but pressed down into you like a hand that wouldn't let go. By late July, the creek had dropped to a trickle, and the grass in the south pasture had gone the color of old straw. It was the kind of season that made men desperate, and desperation made men do things they'd spend the rest of their lives trying to explain away. Delia Marsh had learned that early. She was standing in the kitchen of her uncle's house. If you could call it a kitchen, really, just a corner with a wood stove and 2 shelves. When he came in and set a letter on the table without looking at her, "Got a reply," he said. Delia dried her hands on her apron and looked at the envelope. Her uncle, Harlan Marsh, was a thin man with the particular kind of meanness that came not from cruelty but from smallness. He'd never wanted her. She'd known that since the day he'd shown up at her parents' funeral 7 years ago looking more inconvenienced than grieved. She'd been 16 then. She was 23 now, and the arithmetic of how much she'd cost him versus how much use he'd gotten out of her was a calculation he made often and out loud. "Reply to what?" she asked, though something in her stomach already knew. "Put an ad in the paper," he said. "Rancher up near Cutter's Creek. Lost his wife a while back. Needs someone to manage the house and the children." He pulled the envelope back before she could reach it. "He's offering fair wages and room and board. You put an advertisement for me." Harlan shrugged. "You're 23 years old. You're not getting any younger, and you're eating food I don't have extra of. This is a reasonable arrangement." Delia stood there. The heat pressed in through the single window. Outside, somewhere, a crow called twice and went quiet. "When?" she asked. "Week from Thursday." She nodded. She didn't ask if she had a choice. She already knew the shape of that answer. The man's name was Conrad Aldridge. That was all the letter said. Conrad Aldridge, Cutter's Creek, Texas. 2 children. A ranch that needed managing. A house that needed a hand. Harlan read her the relevant parts like he was reading a bill of sale, which, she supposed, was more or less what it was. He'd accepted $30. Not for her exactly. He was careful about the wording, the way men always were when they wanted to do something they couldn't say plainly. $30 for her train fare and the inconvenience of placing the ad. The night before she left, Delia sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the 4 walls of the room she'd slept in for 7 years. Nothing on them. The window faced east, and in the mornings it let in good light. And that had been the only thing she'd ever liked about it. She packed her trunk slowly. There wasn't much. 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, a tin of sewing needles, a small photograph she kept wrapped in cloth at the bottom of everything. Her parents, young and squinting into the sun, her mother's hand on her father's arm. She didn't sleep much that night. The train ride took most of a day. She watched Texas go by through the window, the flat brown scrub giving way to rockier ground, cedar breaks and limestone outcroppings, the sky enormous and pale with heat. She ate the bread she'd packed and drank water from the canteen she'd brought, and tried not to think too hard about what she was walking into. Cutter's Creek was small. Main Street, a church, a general store, a livery, a saloon that tried to look respectable by keeping its sign modest. The depot was barely more than a platform and a ticket window. Delia stepped off the train with her trunk and stood in the late afternoon heat, looking around. A wagon was pulled up alongside the depot. The horse hitched to it was a big sorrel, solid and patient-looking. The man on the bench was watching her already. Conrad Aldridge was older than she'd pictured. Not old, but weathered, somewhere in his late 30s, maybe touching 40, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that had spent too many years in the sun. He wasn't a large man, but he was solid, the way a fence post is solid, something built to hold against pressure without making a show of it. He had the look of someone who'd been tired for so long he'd stopped noticing. He climbed down when she approached. He didn't smile, but he took her trunk from her before she had to ask. "Miss Marsh," he said. "Mr. Aldridge." He looked at her the way she imagined he'd look at a horse he was considering. Not unkind, but thorough. "Long ride? Long enough." He nodded and lifted her trunk into the wagon bed. "It's about an hour out. Roads rough in places. I'll manage." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite approval. More like he'd been braced for complaint and hadn't gotten it. He climbed back up and she took the bench beside him, and they rode out of Cutter's Creek without another word. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, exactly, but it had weight to it. Delia watched the land open up around them. Cedar and scrub oak, limestone shelves, the occasional live oak spreading wide over nothing. The sun dropped lower and turned everything amber. "How old are your children?" she asked, more to hear something than because she couldn't wait. Conrad's hand stayed easy on the reins. "Nate's 11. Priscilla's 7. How long has it been?" "Since their mother." A pause. 18 months. She didn't push. The way he'd said it, flat and final, like a door he'd already decided wasn't opening. She recognized that. "Some losses you talked around instead of through." "I'll do good work," she said. That's all I'm offering, but I mean it. Conrad looked at her sideways. His eyes were dark, hard to read in the fading light. I know, he said, and went back to watching the road. The ranch appeared out of the dusk, looking smaller than she'd imagined and more worn. A main house, low and square, with a covered porch running across the front. A barn to the east, a chicken coop, a smokehouse. Everything gray-brown with age and weather, the kind of place that had been worked hard and loved hard and was now just being worked. A light burned in the front window. Two shapes appeared on the porch as the wagon pulled up. The boy, Nate, was tall for 11, all sharp elbows and watchful eyes. He had his father's coloring, dark hair, a face already learning to hold things back. He stood with his arms crossed in a way that was too old for him, like he'd adopted a posture that didn't quite fit yet. The girl Priscilla was different. Smaller, lighter, red-brown hair that had come loose from its braid and was going every direction, a spray of freckles across her nose. She stood close to her brother, but she was looking at Delia with open, uncomplicated curiosity. No hostility in it, just interest. Delia climbed down before Conrad could offer a hand. Nate, Priscilla, Conrad said, coming around the wagon. This is Miss Marsh. She's going to be staying on with us and helping with the house. Nate said nothing. His jaw was set. Priscilla said, Are you going to sleep in the house? In the small room? Yes, that was. Priscilla started, and Nate put a hand on her arm, quick and quiet. Priscilla stopped. Delia had heard the sentence anyway. That was Mama's sewing room. She filed it away. Nice to meet you both, she said. I'm tired from the train, and I expect you're tired of waiting on supper. Should we go in? Priscilla nodded. Nate turned and walked inside without a word. The room was small. Barely enough for a cot and a dresser, a hook on the wall for her coat. There was a single window that looked out over the back pasture, and whoever had used the room before her had left a small dried flower on the windowsill, lavender long since faded. Delia left it where it was. Supper that first night was beans. Conrad had left simmering and cornbread she found the batter for in the cold box. She put it together without asking whether she should. Priscilla sat at the table and watched her with the focused attention of a child cataloging everything. Nate ate fast and left. Conrad ate in the way of a man who'd forgotten food was supposed to be something other than fuel. It's good, he said, which she suspected was more than he said most nights. She washed the dishes after. When she turned around, Conrad was gone. She heard the back door close quiet behind him, boots on the porch steps. She stood there in the kitchen listening to the house settle. She was here. Whatever that meant, she was here. The days shaped themselves quickly into a pattern. She woke before light, got the stove going, started coffee and breakfast. Conrad was always already up, already gone to the barn before she came out of her room. The children appeared one by one as the smell of food reached them. Priscilla, first eager and immediate, climbing into her chair and asking what was for breakfast before her eyes were fully open. Nate last, dressed and deliberate, sitting down without looking at Delia, eating without talking. She didn't try to make him talk. She'd learned early that pushing a door that wasn't ready only made it harder to open later. What she did instead was work. There was no shortage of it. The house had been running on survival mode for a year and a half. Clean but not clean, organized but not really. She found the system that had existed before and rebuilt it quietly, without announcing what she was doing. She mended the curtains. She reorganized the pantry so things were where you could actually find them. She found Priscilla's winter coat in a trunk, too small now, and let it out at the seams as much as she could. Priscilla noticed everything. She followed Delia around the way she imagined a duckling followed a duck. Not demanding, just present, narrating things she observed in a constant soft murmur. The biscuits smelled different than Papa's. Miss Marsh, do you know how to fix a button because mine came off my Sunday dress? And Nate tried, but he lost the thread. Miss Marsh, what's your favorite color? Miss Marsh, why do you braid your hair like that? Delia answered all of it. She figured Priscilla had been storing up questions for 18 months, and the least she could do was receive them. Nate was harder. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't even rude, not exactly. He just removed himself. He ate and worked and did his chores and spoke when spoken to. And every single thing he did made clear that he had not asked for her to be there and wasn't pretending otherwise. One morning she found him in the barn trying to repair a bridle with hands that weren't quite big enough for the task yet. He had his father's tools spread out and was working with careful, frustrated concentration. You want some help? She asked. No. She sat down on a hay bale anyway, not next to him, just nearby after a minute. Your father teach you that? Nate's hands stilled, then reluctantly. Some of it. I watched mostly. The trick with that particular stitch, Delia said, is that you've got to pull it tighter than feels right, then it doesn't work loose. Silence. Then he turned slightly toward her. How do you know? My father had horses. I helped. Nate looked at her for a long second. Then he turned back to the bridle and said, without warmth but without coldness either, show me. She did. They worked in silence. When the bridle was done, Nate inspected it, nodded once, and said, "Thanks," in the voice of someone who decided it cost him nothing to say it. She went back to the house and didn't make anything of it. But something had shifted, small and fragile. The summer heat pressed on. Conrad worked from before dawn until past dark, the way of a man trying to outrun his own head. She watched him come in some evenings with his hands cracked and bleeding, and wrap them himself at the kitchen table, before going back out to check on something, and she started leaving a clean cloth and the salve out where he'd find it without her having to say anything. He never mentioned it, but it was always used by morning. They talked in the kitchen sometimes at the end of the day while she was finishing up and he was sitting with his coffee. Not long conversations, not personal ones, mostly. The price of feed, whether the roan mare was favoring her left foreleg, what the weather looked like for the week. She learned the shape of how he communicated. Careful, exact. Not wasteful with words, but not cold either. Like a man who'd decided a long time ago that everything he said should mean something. Once, about 3 weeks in, he came in from the barn later than usual and stopped in the kitchen doorway. "Priscilla asked you about her mother," he said. Delia turned from the stove. "Not directly. She talks around it." Conrad looked at his hands. "She doesn't want to upset me. I know. I don't know how to tell her that she can." Delia was quiet for a moment. "Then maybe start by not working until you can't stand up every night," she said, "so she has a chance to find you when you're still standing." It came out more direct than she'd meant it. She half expected him to leave. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes, and then he said, "That's fair," and went to his room. She stood in the kitchen alone and pressed her hands flat against the counter and breathed. The trouble started in September. The creek that ran through the south end of the Aldridge property was the best water source for 10 miles in any direction. It was also, according to a neighbor named Hollis Crane, partly his, or so he claimed when he appeared one afternoon while Conrad was in town, riding up to the house on a tall black horse with the air of a man who expected to be agreed with. Delia was on the porch, shelling beans. "Is Aldridge here?" Crane said, not getting down. "He's in town. Can I help you?" Crane looked at her the way men like him looked at women they'd already categorized. "Tell him Crane came by. Tell him I've been patient long enough about the South Creek access, and I'll be talking to my lawyer if he's not ready to discuss terms." "I'll tell him," Delia said. Crane rode off. Delia set down her beans and sat for a minute thinking. When Conrad came back that evening, she told him. His face didn't change much, but his jaw tightened in the way she'd learned meant he was holding something down. "What does he actually want?" she asked. "Water rights, the creek access. There's a section of fence that cuts off his cattle from the best part of the water. He says the fence is on his land. Is it? I don't know. The survey's old. Could be a mistake." Conrad rubbed a hand over his face. "Lawyers cost money I don't have." "Then don't start with lawyers," Delia said. "What does he need the water for?" "His herd. Dry season, the other sources aren't reliable." Delia thought, what if you gave him access during the dry months only, gate in the fence? His cattle can use the creek when they need to, and he drops the claim? Conrad looked at her. Why would he go for that? Because what he actually needs is water. The lawsuit is the means, not the end. If you give him the end, he doesn't need the means. Conrad was quiet for a long time, and if he won't, then we know what he really wants, and we deal with that. But start with the thing that might work. They rode to Crane's place 2 days later. Delia didn't expect to come along, but Conrad simply said, 2 heads, and she climbed up. Crane was surprised to see her. He was more surprised when she did most of the talking. By the end of an hour, they had an agreement, seasonal creek access, no lawyers, both men shaking hands in Crane's dusty yard. On the ride home, Conrad said nothing for a long time. Then, "Where did you learn to do that?" "Do what?" "Talk to people like that, figure out what they want." Delia looked at the road ahead. "My uncle was always wanting something he wouldn't say plainly. You learn to read past the words." Conrad glanced at her. "He's the one who sent you here, yes." He didn't ask more, but his silence had changed quality, something softer in it. Then in October, Nate got sick. It started as a cough, the ordinary kind, the kind that came with the change of season. But by the 3rd day, he was feverish, and by the 4th, he couldn't keep anything down. And the fever had climbed high enough that Delia pressed her hand to his forehead and felt real fear move through her. The doctor was 12 miles away, and the road had been washed out in a recent rain. Conrad stood in the doorway of Nate's room looking like a man who had already lost too much to survive losing more. "I'll stay with him," Delia said. "He doesn't. He needs someone to stay with him, and you need to keep the ranch from falling apart while he's down. Let me do this." She didn't give him a chance to argue. She moved into Nate's room and didn't leave. For 3 days she sat beside him, cooling him with wet cloths when the fever spiked, making him sip broth even when he fought it, talking to him quietly when he was restless and letting him sleep when he could. Priscilla appeared in the doorway every few hours, wide-eyed and quiet in a way that wasn't natural for her. Is he going to be okay? She whispered, the second night. Delia looked at her. Yes, she said, with more certainty than she had. He's going to be okay. Priscilla nodded. She stood there another second, then slipped away. Conrad came in very late that second night when the house was quiet. He stood over Nate's bed, watching his son breathe, and Delia watched him, the way his hands hung at his sides, useless for once, unable to work his way out of this. He's holding, she said quietly. Conrad didn't look at her. You should sleep. You should too. He shook his head. He pulled the other chair up to the opposite side of the bed and sat down, and they kept watch together through the long dark hours without speaking. On the fourth morning the fever broke. Nate opened his eyes, looked at the ceiling, and said in a rough, irritated voice, I'm hungry. Delia laughed before she could stop herself. Short and surprised, a real laugh, the kind that came from relief so sharp it came out wrong. She pressed her hand over her mouth and then just let herself laugh. And after a moment, Conrad made a sound that was almost the same thing. She made Nate eggs and toast, and he ate all of it and asked for more. When she came back out of his room, Conrad was in the hall. He looked at her with that difficult expression she'd come to recognize as the one he wore when he was feeling something he didn't know what to do with. Thank you, he said. He did the hard part? You sat with him for 3 days. I know. Conrad looked like he wanted to say more. Instead, he nodded and walked away, but the next morning she found a small wooden box on the kitchen table. Plain, careful work, the corners fitted clean. No note. Delia turned it over in her hands. Then she set it on the windowsill in her room, next to the dried lavender, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she let herself feel something that was almost like belonging. Winter came. The ranch felt different in the cold, smaller, more contained. The four of them gathered around the dinner table with the fire going and the wind working at the windows. And it wasn't comfortable exactly, but it was something, present, solid. Nate started talking to her. Not much, not easily, but he did. He'd ask her opinion on things sometimes. The best way to mend a particular piece of tack, whether he should tell his father about the section of fence that was leaning. And she answered him straight, the way she answered everything, and he seemed to respect that in the particular way boys that age respected things that didn't talk down to them. One evening in December, he came and stood in the kitchen doorway while she was making pie. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. Why are you here? She kept her hands in the dough. Your father needed help. That's not what I mean. She looked up. He was watching her with those careful dark eyes, his father's eyes, and he looked older than 11. He'd been older than 11 for a while, she thought. My uncle had no use for me anymore, she said. This was better than the alternative. What was the alternative? Worse. Nate was quiet. Are you glad you came? Delia thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. I think I'm getting there, she said. He nodded, slow and considering. Then he said, I'm glad you didn't leave. When I was sick. Some people would have. I'm not some people. No, he said. I know that now. And he went to bed. January brought a cold that settled in the bones of the house, and with it, everything Delia had been trying not to think about. She'd heard it at church in Cutter's Creek. The careful, not quite whispered kind of talk that women did when they wanted to say something without being held accountable for saying it. That Aldridge man has a woman living out on that ranch. No relation, no ring on her finger. She'd caught enough of it to know it was happening and to know it wasn't going to stop. She tried not to let it matter. It mattered. She was hanging laundry on a cold, clear morning when Conrad came around the corner of the house and stopped. You heard them, he said. Not a question. Sunday. Yes. He leaned against the fence post. His face was doing the thing it did when he was working something through internally that wasn't going well. I'm sorry, I didn't think about. You hired help. That's not something you need to apologize for. It's not that simple, and you know it. She did know it. She pulled a shirt from the basket and pinned it. What are you going to do about it? He was quiet long enough that she looked at him. He was looking at the ground, jaw tight. I've been thinking, he said finally, about what this has become, what you've become to this house, to the children. He stopped. Say it plain, she said. You're capable of it. He looked up at her. I don't want you to leave. That started out being about the children needing you, and somewhere along the way it became about me needing you too. And I don't know what to do with that except say it out loud and see what you do with it. The cold wind moved between them. Delia set down the shirt. She turned to face him fully. Conrad, I'm not asking for anything you don't want to give. I just Conrad. She waited until he stopped. Are you asking me to stay, properly? He looked at her for a long moment. Then, with the particular careful deliberateness of a man who chose words like he chose tools, only when they were right for the job. Yes. If you'll have me, if you'll have this, all of it. She thought about her parents' house, gone. About Harlan's kitchen, going cold. About the small room with the lavender on the windowsill, and the wooden box, and the sound of Priscilla talking, and Nate's grudging half-smile, and the way this ranch had started, somewhere between September and now, to feel like something she didn't want to leave. "I'll have it," she said. The wedding was small, the way everything they did was small. The minister in town, Nate and Priscilla standing in their Sunday best, Mrs. Patton from the general store as witness, a handful of neighbors who'd come around to minding their own business. Priscilla cried the happy kind, before anyone had even said anything. Nate stood straight and didn't cry, and afterward shook Conrad's hand, which made Conrad blink hard at the wall behind him for a second. They rode home in the wagon, the four of them, and Priscilla fell asleep against Delia's arm before they'd gone 2 miles. "You all right?" Conrad asked quietly. "Yes," she said, and meant it. The first real test of the new year was the fire. In February, a neighbor's barn went up, and the wind was wrong, and a spark caught the edge of the Aldridge fence line and ran fast through the dry winter grass. Conrad and Nate fought it for 2 hours with wet blankets and shovels while Delia kept Priscilla back and prayed. And when it was over, the south fence was gone, and a section of pasture was black, but the barn and the house were standing. They lost 4 head of cattle. They couldn't afford it. Conrad came in that night and sat at the table and didn't speak for a long time. "We'll rebuild the fence first," Delia said. "The pasture will come back in spring. The cattle—" She stopped then. "I have the money I've been saving. It's not much, but it's something." Conrad looked at her sharply. "That's yours. It's ours now. Delia, we're not having this argument," she said. "We're having the conversation about how we fix it. That's a different conversation." He looked at her with that expression she'd come to know as his version of being overwhelmed, when the walls he kept up didn't quite hold everything he was feeling. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "All right," he said quietly. "Tell me how we fix it." They did. Spring came, the way it always did, indifferent to whether you'd earned it. The pasture greened up. Crane sent 2 of his men over to help rebuild the south fence without being asked, which was its own kind of answer about the value of dealing straight. Nate turned 12 and started working alongside Conrad in a way that had shifted from boy, helping to something more like partnership. And Conrad let him, which was not a small thing for a man who'd held everything so tight for so long. One afternoon in April, Delia found Priscilla in the small room, her old room, now just for sewing, sitting on the floor with a tin box in her lap, looking at a photograph. Delia stood in the doorway. "You all right?" Priscilla looked up. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. "This is my mama," she said. "She kept this in here. I found it." Delia sat down on the floor beside her. She looked at the photograph, a young woman with light eyes, and Priscilla's red-brown hair, not smiling exactly, but close to it, like someone had said something just before the picture was taken. "She looks like you," Delia said. "Papa says I have her smile. That's a good thing to have." Priscilla was quiet for a minute, turning the tin in her hands. "I don't want to forget her," she said, "but I don't want to be sad all the time either." "Is that wrong?" Delia looked at this girl, 7 years old, carrying something enormous with that particular child's directness that could break your heart clean in 2. "No," she said, "that's not wrong. That's how it's supposed to work eventually. You carry both." Priscilla leaned against her. Delia put her arm around her, and they sat there together on the floor, the photograph between them, the April light coming in through the small window. Conrad found them like that. He stood in the doorway a long moment before either of them heard him. When Priscilla noticed, she held up the photograph. "I found Mama's box, Papa." Conrad came in slowly and knelt down. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked at Delia, and she saw everything in his face that he hadn't said and didn't need to. "I know," she said quietly. He nodded. He sat down on the floor with them, his back against the wall, his daughter leaning on one side, and his hand finding Delia's on the other, and they stayed like that until the light changed and Priscilla fell asleep between them, with the tin box clutched to her chest. Summer came around again, a year from when Delia had stepped off the train with her small trunk and nothing she was sure of. The creek was running again. A good year for water, and the cattle were fat, and the garden was coming in strong, and the debt from the fire was nearly paid. She was on the porch one evening, the heat finally beginning to ease, watching the light go gold across the pasture, when Conrad came up beside her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That it looks different than it did a year ago. The pasture? Everything." He leaned on the railing beside her. He'd been doing that more lately, standing near her the way people stood near things that mattered to them, not performing it, just doing it. "Nate asked me something today," he said. "What?" "Asked if you were going to stay." He paused. "I told him yes." He said, "I know, I just needed you to say it." Delia looked at the pasture. The light was doing something extraordinary with the cedar, turning it the color of copper. "That boy," she said. He's all right. He is. She was quiet a moment. So are you. Conrad made a sound that was half breath, half something else. He put his hand over hers on the railing, his rough, warm fingers settling over hers the way they always did. Like it was easy, like they'd always done it, like they'd worked out between them without discussing it that this was how things were. The light dropped lower. Inside the house, she could hear Priscilla singing something tuneless and persistent, and the sound of Nate telling her to stop, and Priscilla not stopping. You know what I thought, Delia said, when I stepped off that train, when I saw you sitting on that wagon bench looking like you were bracing for something terrible. What? I thought. At least he looks honest. Conrad turned to look at her. That's all? That was everything. I'd had enough of the other kind. She looked back at the pasture. I was right, for the record. About what? You being honest. He was quiet for a moment. Then, in the voice he saved for things he meant completely, you were the bravest thing I didn't ask for. She laughed, real and easy, the way she laughed now without thinking about it. I'll take that, she said. The last light held for another few minutes, long and slow and gold, and then it let go the way good things did. Not all at once, but gradually, the way something becomes part of you, until you can't say anymore when it started or where the edges were. She stood on that porch with his hand over hers, listening to her children argue inside the house, and felt something she hadn't had a name for when she arrived and now didn't need one. She was home. It had taken a year and a liar uncle and a rusted creek fence, and a boy who wouldn't talk, and a girl who wouldn't stop, and a man who'd forgotten how to ask for help to get here. But she was here, and she meant to stay.